So the idea was that if you could just get rid of a superstition or the stranglehold that the superstition had, not only on people's cognitions, but on our institutions, then you would pave the way for a new era of enlightenment, human flourishing.
An epistemology is not a one-for-one for a moral system.
Yeah, so I'll push back on that if I may.
Okay, yeah.
The reason that isn't true is because
we talked a little bit before the stream about this idea that you have of a substitution hypothesis. Is that your idea? Did you come up with that, or?
I've been trying to figure that out. I don't know. I thought it was either mine, James Lindsay, or Jordan Peterson's. And I asked Jim if it was his idea. He said no. But I don't know. I'm sure someone's thought of something analogous.
Well, what is it?
I coined it. I don't know.
Can you explain it to us?
So it's the idea that as one ideology fades, another will take its place. So there's a lot to unpack there. So every culture is many philosophers have written about this, like Alistair McIntyre. Every philosopher is subject to there's a dominant value of every age, whether it's Christianity. In Homer's time, it was strength, and Voltaire's time was, humor. Now it's wokeism. And the substitution hypothesis is the idea that as one dominant ideology or dominant moral orthodoxy fades, another will come in to take its place. So it's like the Game of Thrones is a good way to think about it. The only reason that people stopped believing, the only reason that people have new gods is because they stopped believing in the old gods. And so the idea now is, as Christianity has fallen, wokeism has taken its place, and many atheists are now, most kind of popular conventional atheists are now woke or in the orbit of woke ideology. And so is that relationship necessary? That, in other words, is there a kind of a cyclical historical phenomenon of one ideology replacing another? Was that a clear explanation?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I mentioned before the stream that we had talked, I don't know, maybe a year ago now. And I had kind of come to this conclusion myself before it kind of started catching steam that.
You created the substitution hypothesis. That's why you asked this question.
Obviously. Well, no, we've even, Sitch and I have even talked about this on the show. I have a very Heidean way of looking at religion, as in religion is this thing that evolves over time, and all of these cultural adaptations, they either work and deliver communities that thrive, or they destroy communities. Mm-hmm. So I understand Christianity from that evolutionary perspective, and even in the days of the atheist community, the anti-theist community, the God delusion was getting big. Dawkins was kind of blowing up. There was Sam Harris was blowing up. The four horsemen of the atheists, the four horsemen of the anti-theists were blowing up because a lot of it happened during September 11th, which was perceived by a lot of people as, religion gone amok. Mm-hmm. And I was curious if a lot of the proposals that the anti-theists were making were actually feasible, because if you look at religion from an evolutionary perspective, you've got something that's evolved over time and has kind of been shaped by the social environment. And when you're trying to create a kind of culture of just being evidence-based, I'm not necessarily sure that it will work. And it seems like you had a lot more, you thought this was a lot more promising endeavor at one point in your life. Can you kind of speak to that, your transition?
Yeah, why don't I try my transition? Speak to my transition. So the idea was that if you could just get rid of a superstition or the stranglehold that the superstition had, not only on people's cognitions, but on our institutions, then you would pave the way for a new era of enlightenment, human flourishing. Mm-hmm. The question is whether or not superstitious belief, or patenticity, as Michael Shermer calls it, agenticity, the belief that there are patents everywhere, the belief that there are agents everywhere, is that the default state? And if it is the default state, then we need to have one more. I'm going to introduce one more variable into this conversation. Are some delusions more socially beneficial or socially efficacious than others? Another way of looking at that is, are some delusions worse than others? I mean, anybody who thinks about that for 2 seconds would realize, yes, that's true. For example, if somebody has the delusion that every single person on Earth really has a invisible sombrero on their head and they're walking around with that, that's an innocuous belief. It's a delusion. I shouldn't have said belief, but that's an innocuous delusion. But if somebody has the delusion that all left-handed people, that Satan wants them to kill all left-handed people, that's clearly a far worse delusion. So the question becomes, if the substitution hypothesis is true, and we admit that not all delusions are equal, some delusions are worse than others, what do we do about it?
Right.
I mean, it is fascinating that a religion popped up in the middle of an anti-religious movement. That a religion popped up, right? And then
seems like evidence for the substitution hypothesis, especially.
Right. Yeah. And I was talking to, I won't mention the person's name, but I was talking to a very famous theist when I was in London, and I said to him, it's interesting how the people who participate in this religion don't even acknowledge it as a religion. I'm talking about secular people, atheists. They don't even see it or acknowledge it as a religion. And we talked about this, and he's like, yeah, this is terrible. It's a religion. It's a religion. And I said to him, but you're religious. You're religious. So you're criticizing other people for being religious when you yourself are religious. And that led to a fascinating conversation. Reed would have been there, but his brother derailed that entire trip for us. He was getting married.
Yeah, Reed, I obviously know you from the street epistemology community, and I don't know if you'd classify yourself as an anti-theist. I mean, you and I are both huge fans of Haidt. So do you want to, where are you at these days as far as this substitution hypothesis goes?
I think it is the case that culture evolves, moral orthodoxies change depending on what ideas get propagated in the culture over time. What is the alternate hypothesis? That one moral orthodoxy will just stay the same for all of time? I don't think that's possible. Knowledge evolves, including moral knowledge. So as long as there's conjecture and criticism happening in culture, hopefully it evolves in a good way, based, towards moral truth and moral, and just regular knowledge. So I expect culture to keep evolving and us to be less wrong about basic facts of the universe and basic moral facts. We can just keep talking about it and finding better ways of living a good life, and I expect that to keep going.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for the
Please.
substitution hypothesis, which is it's because it's not like it's people on the right who we generally classically would have thought of as like religious and Christian who have kind of become, woke, which is what we're kind of talking about, like woke replacing Christianity or some other belief system. It seems to be, it's primarily or just only people on the left that have kind of absorbed this kind of new woke religion.
No.
Which were you don't agree with that?
No. Many religious people are woke, and there are many religious ceremonies that have included elements of wokeism.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I don't want to interrupt you, but we also at some point have to include in this conversation how the concept of what it means to flourish for an individual in a community is changed by the orthodoxy.
Right.
But please continue.
Well, so even in the religious places where because I know, and James talked about this a lot, where there is a lot of like woke Christianity stuff, and I think he even talks about how a lot of wokeness derived originally from Christian social justice,
Right.
But that still seems to be, I would imagine, that those people are still, you gave them a Haidt moral foundation test, or they took a political compass test. They definitely they tend to be people on the left, not people on the right.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in Latin America with liberation theology. You see that with, So so bracketing for the moment whether or not this new moral phenomena, if the substitution hypothesis is correct, are all people equally susceptible to, I don't, you can call it a culture bound syndrome. You could be pejorative and call it a derangement syndrome, but whatever it is, are some people with some pre-existing beliefs are more susceptible to the ideology than others.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, mhm.
yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if it's more not the case that like the left had believed in nothing, and so wokeness filled the void, as opposed to the way that I look. Have you seen this is going to be funny to the people in our chat? Have you seen the Barbie movie at all?
No,
Okay.
no, I can't fathom such a thing. But
Yeah, it's like one of the most overtly woke movies around. But there's a part in the movie where basically the Ken character decides to bring the patriarchy to Barbie Land, and all the Barbie characters immediately fall for it and become subjugated by it. And the rationale the movie gives is that since the Barbies never grew up in our society, they had no defense, no inoculation against the patriarchy, essentially. And I'm wondering if that's kind of what happened with the left, where for so many years, at least in America, the left had been erecting all these all these guardrails and all this gatekeeping to prevent like the right wing religious beliefs and right wing quote irrational beliefs from kind of infiltrating science and culture. And they had been so concerned about it coming from the right that essentially when like the anti-liberal leftists came from behind, they just had no defenses. They're completely caught unprepared for this.
yeah, that I don't. Maybe that plays a small role, but remember, traditional leftists, certainly not even traditional, even when I was growing up, the left was always for free speech. The left was for open inquiry. The left was not the far left, of course, but the left
Right.
was for, they wanted debates. I just watched, I think it was a Netflix special. I'm almost finished with it, with Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley, about their conversations in the 90s. So the left today wants different things, but one of the things they have always traditionally wanted was disputation, debate, argumentation, etc. And now the left has been paresthetized by wokeism, and they don't want any of those things. A friend of mine was telling me, this is anecdotal, but I think it speaks to something. A friend of mine made a joke, and this person was offended by the joke, and now she won't even speak to him. And they were friends. Like, she won't even speak to him because of the joke. They won't even. And he said, "Well, why don't we go out and have dinner and talk about it?" She's having none of it. So there is this kind of moral purity that both the right and the left have had, but the difference now is that there is an allergy to any kind of conversation about objections to basic stances and positions.
Do you think that the left being, so in favor of free speech and free debate and all these ideas, at least in the past, do you think that was intrinsic to, I don't know, like left-wing thought
No,
or left-wing moral philosophy, or is it just kind of a response to the right kind of controlling culture in America?
No, I don't. I think all ideologies are a grab bag. It's a mix and match. You just reach your hand in there and you come out over time. And I think that when the right controlled many of our institutions, and now the left controls most of our institutions, certainly most of our legacy institutions, and the left will be singing quite a different tune if and when the pendulum swings the other way. Then they'll be the ones clamoring. Like right now, the right was never clamoring when I was a kid. They wanted to ban Dungeons and Dragons. They wanted to ban, the right-wing Democrats like Al Gore and his wife Tipper Gore wanted to ban certain songs, and yeah. So no, I don't. I think it's just you can mix and match any. Like, if you could just write out on pieces of paper beliefs and public policy prescriptions, there's no necessary connection between any of those. I mean, you could find a meta narrative like, free markets, and then you could say build or construct your own ideology around assembling like a Lego superstructure, open markets, legalization of marijuana, etc. So you would have to find a meta narrative to do that. The meta narrative of wokeness, of people who claim there is no meta narrative, is the idea that oppression is inherent in every system. But within that, you can just mix and match. You could still reach into the grab bag and look at different ways to remediate that oppression.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you watched Coleman Hughes at all. He interviewed two brothers, Hiram Lewis and Verlin Lewis, recently, and they had this idea that essentially no one really has ideology beyond tribalism. It's just kind of like they're born to some location or some stance, kind of puts them on one team or the other, and they just adopt everything based on what the team does. Do you agree with that, or do you disagree?
That idea has been percolating for a while. It has a long pedigree in the history of Western intellectual thought. I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm thinking about the case of the American Taliban, John Walker Lindz, who went to Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I think tribalism is certainly a part of it, and James Lindsay and I have written some stuff about this. People want to belong more than they want to be right, and that tribalism. I mean, if tribalism weren't a case, then you could look at a global map of religion around the world, and it would be like a pointillism painting, right? There'd be individuals everywhere who had different beliefs, but those religions cluster. And so it's a complex problem, but no, I don't agree with that. I think it's a blunt diagnostic tool to look at the problem of wide-scale mimetic belief and adaptation of ideologies.
Yeah, because I don't fully agree with it. I think that essentially people do have maybe even an innate moral intuition that pushes them in one direction or the other. But then I think after that, I do think that the brain is essentially so good at post hoc justification that as long as it's argued according to that left or right wing foundational thought, basically almost anyone can justify anything as long as the argument is correct, and as long as the team that they're on is pushing it. And I wonder if that's what's going on with kind of what you were talking about, with the left kind of completely switching their stance on free speech once they grabbed control of the institutions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to do an argument with my ethics students. I used to do a pedagogical exercise with my ethics students, in that I teach them the basic kind of ways of thinking about ethics, deontology, which is basically rights, rules, responsibility. Egoism is me, consequentialism or utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. You look at the consequences of your action, or greatest good for greatest number. And then they would go around and justify various moral positions. They would make moral arguments. Of course, you could never do this today because you'd have to justify things that were morally unfashionable. But then what I'd have them do is, it's very easy to argue the other side, but what's less easy, and it takes about 2 weeks to teach people how to do this, is you teach them how to use one theory that they don't think goes with the policy position, to use that theory to justify the policy. So, for example, a border wall or death penalty. What is in the greatest good for the greatest number? Use utilitarianism to argue for that. Use deontology to argue for that. Use egoism to argue for that. So you can pretty much use any broad ethical system, be it secular or not, to argue for pretty much any policy position. And so, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it really is a kind of, there are so many variables at play. It's the mix and match. It's the tribalism. It's that there's no necessity in, we tend to think that there's necessity in, historical outcomes or what have you. But that's just a form of moral myopia, right? That's a form of tribalism. Like, we happen to be born in this country who believes this thing at that point. If anything, that's kind of making a postmodern point. But that speaks to what Reed said, is we need to develop stronger epistemologies and better tools to enable us to do a few things: weed out truth from falsity, calibrate our confidence to the evidence, etc. But the problem is that you could be living in a community where either you don't have the access to those tools, and I'm thinking about like if you live in a country in which there's Sharia law, or they limit access to information. And I'm thinking about basically any totalitarian state, Iran, North Korea, China. And so they limit your ability to do that. But I hope I'm being clear right now. But the key to this whole thing is that people have to want to believe true things, and they have to. It's not just enough that they have access to epistemological tools like street epistemology. They have to want to believe those things, and they have to live in a society where claiming that they've changed their mind, that they no longer believe in the orthodoxy, won't get them murdered.
It seems like we're talking about a difference, though, between epistemology and a moral system. I look at a moral system as like a set of rules that pretty much anybody can buy into to live a life that will produce good things for them, will cause them to thrive. And I don't necessarily know, like epistemology is about how we believe certain things in the world, right? I don't know that that's totally essential to a moral system. It seems like a lot of what the atheist community is doing, the anti-theist community is doing, is they're kind of trying to make empiricism into a moral system. And I'm not exactly sure if you can do that. Like I look, Sitch and I are both science people. Like we believe in evidence, logic, reason for determining truth about the world. But I don't necessarily know that I don't believe that knowing true things about the world is necessarily going to produce the best moral system for people who are just living their lives.
Okay, so there's a ton to unpack there. Let's unpack that. So I want to push back on one thing you said about the definition. You can adopt a moral system. I'm thinking of the Taliban or ISIS or some.
Well, let's do Christianity. It doesn't have to be like a.
Well, you said positive, because somebody can adopt a moral system and have it become like they think they're acting in their own well-being, but they're not.
Right, but they can also adopt a moral system that they believe completely untrue things, that they are acting in their self-interest. Like I would argue that is the goal of some moral system.
Yeah, correct. They believe, for example, if they're nice to people and they sacrifice, etc., then they'll get the big prize at the end of the day.
Right, yes. Suppressing selfishness is a problem in all societies. Trust is a problem in all societies.
Correct. And so is your argument then that we shouldn't be teaching people to develop epistemologies that are more reliable? We should be teaching them to value certain moral dispositions like kindness and epistemic humility. Is that the argument?
Well, I think people need a moral system. I think they do need a set of rules that is going to govern their lives. And I look to Christianity and I think, okay, the rules that they're putting together for Christianity are like, be honest, right? Sacrifice for others. Don't be a narcissistic piece of shit. Like basic rules that I think are good for a society. I don't think that how you come to truth in the world can necessarily map onto that. It's not a one-for-one. An epistemology is not a one-for-one for a moral system.
Yeah, so I'll push back on that if I may.
Okay, yeah.
The reason that isn't true is because if you want to create systems, if you want to create well-being for yourself and your communities, systems that lead to your human flourishing, and we can unpack that if you want, it is absolutely essential that the building blocks of those systems are based upon true things. And so if you want to create a world outside yourself that will bring about your flourishing and the flourishing of your community, then you have to predicate what you're building upon what's true. Because if you don't, and you predicate it upon what's false, you could be acting in a way that you think is in your own self-interest, but it's actually not. It's incredibly destructive to yourself and your communities.
Well, I'm not sure that I mean, there's two levels of operation here. There is obviously like I said, I believe that we should, at some level, understand what is truthfully going on. But as far as somebody adopting a moral system, I don't know if you've heard of the supernatural punishment hypothesis, which is this idea that people behave better if they feel like they're being watched.
Yeah, they've done that test with little kids in marshmallows.
It's a little bit different than the marshmallow test. The marshmallow test is kind of like whether or not they can hold off. I think they offer them like two marshmallows when they leave.
Yeah, they've put dolls in the room. Have you seen that?
Oh, okay. Yeah, interesting. So they do it with the marshmallow test. Yeah, okay.
Just eyes on a clock or something.
Sure. So you guys understand this. So if a society adopts this untrue belief that God exists and is watching them and will punish them if they misbehave or lie or whatever, you're going to get certain benefits that society produces that are not based on scientific truth.
Okay, the problem is that once you've posited something like that, you've erased the demarcation boundary between what's true and what people believe. For example, if you say, well, God is watching you and you do this, etc., one could easily fall into the belief that, well, why should we protect the environment? God will take care of us. Or in our scripture, we know our scripture is true because of some supernatural belief. Someone walked on water, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So we don't need to do certain things that's in our own self-interest, or we don't need to be concerned about or worry about it. So if you don't, so not only is there a problem with the demarcation boundary, but you're also, once you allow that, then you're opening the floodgates to every rank bias and superstition possible. And you're just kind of abnegating your responsibility as a moral agent. And I don't see how that could possibly lead to any good long term. Unless go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, I think, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Donald Hoffman. Donald Hoffman kind of lays this out specifically in his work, where he says, obviously the world is structured in a way that we narrow it down to things that are not necessarily true, but are evolutionarily advantageous. So I don't necessarily know that truth in the scientific sense. And like I said, at some level, I do believe that people in society should struggle to know important things and know things, factual things. It's the scientific community that does this. But I'm not convinced that the scientific community going out to the world and trying to produce some sort of moral system that is based on factual reality is going to produce a good society, a successful society. So
no. So that's the idea of overlapping magisterium. Gould's idea that science has its domain and religion has its domain, and never the two shall meet. It's not that science goes on. So this is a kind of moral epistemology. It's not that scientists go out there and they construct this this moral foundations theory in which they have very specific prescriptions to act based upon scientific evidence. Causally, it's the other way around. It's that we have a body of hopefully we have a body upon which we can rely. That's why peer review is so important, that it not be corrupted. And that's why it's so important that our institutions are beyond right, left. They have no wings. They're just truth-seeking institutions. And then people take that information, which is independent, ideally independent and value neutral, and then they make policy prescriptions that are inherently value driven based upon that data. So it's not causally, it's not that scientists are morals. You don't make a moral system on a body of empirical evidence, but you use empirical evidence to make decisions about public policy matters that lead to the flourishing of individuals or not. That's the that's the causality there.
I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree. Obviously, you can use your moral intuitions to come to some ideas about how to build your moral system. But ultimately, you're going to want to validate that moral system is going to produce good outcomes through science,
Yeah. Okay, that's the other thing. What you just said is very, very, very important. The other thing is you need some way to test whether or not the outcome produced what you wanted it to. And so for that, you need science, right? You need to figure it out. But the question is the outcome you're trying to produce the outcome you should produce? And that's a fundamentally moral question.
Yeah. Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.